Hello and welcome to this very special Cadbury Centre event on faith, philanthropy and freedom of expression. My name is Dr Maryyum Mahmood and I am the Associate Director of the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham. And I will be hosting and chairing tonight's event. Well, not tonight, today's event, I should say, depending on where you're joining us from, given that this is quite a global event, I'd like to think. So before we begin, just a few points on housekeeping and logistics. This event will last just over an hour, we anticipate, depending on how long we wish to speak though. I'll begin by introducing our wonderful panel and I'll be asking each of them a few questions, after which we'll be opening the floor to Q&A from our audience. Please note that the Q&A function, depending on what device you're using, either is at the bottom or top of your screen. Please note that this is open at all times throughout our talk, so you're welcome to use that to put your questions into the Q&A box. And my wonderful colleague, Matt Cluley from the events team, will be keeping an eye out for any questions. Finally, this event is being recorded, so if you have signed up via Eventbrite, you will receive an email of the recording in due course. Now to the topic, faith, philanthropy, and freedom of expression. Free speech, advocacy, and religious freedom are all at the cornerstone of democratic societies. It is through the challenges posed by free speech in the form of dialogue and debate that really enables us to develop and disseminate various different ideas in line with an ever-changing world. Now, while an individual's right to express themselves freely must be protected, it is also a paramount duty on part of civil society as well as government leaders to balance this value with public safety and ensure that the rights of others are also protected. This is especially important in the context of an increasing political and social polarization that we see in our midst, be that in democratic societies or beyond. Interfaith relations do play a crucial role in making space for such discussions and creating coalitions to address key issues by breaking down hierarchies of sensitivities without diminishing differences of opinion. What we need to understand is each other's contexts, and in order to overcome biases, demystify misconceptions, and foster social harmony over hate, it is necessary for us to be having these conversations to begin with. But how exactly do we do all of this? How and what is it that we must overcome? What are the key challenges that emerge that might inhibit our activities? And what significance does this debate hold in the realm of philanthropic giving? So to unpack all of this and make sense of it, joining me this evening is a distinguished panel of thinkers from the UK and across the Atlantic. So closer to home, we have with us Elizabeth Oldfield, who is the former director of Theos, a research-driven religion and society think tank here in the UK. Elizabeth is currently a visiting lecturer with us here at UOB, University of Birmingham, and an experienced leader and writer and podcaster with a passion for public engagement on issues related to faith and identity, amongst many other things. Then across the pond, we have Michael Weir, who happens to be a Cadbury Centre Honorary Fellow. He is the founder of Public Square Strategies LLC and a leading expert and strategist at the intersections of faith, politics, and American public life. Michael is renowned in the field and has directed faith outreach for President Obama's historic 2012 re-election campaign. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. Abbas Barzegar, who is the director of the Horizon Forum, where he stewards its collaborative and stakeholder-centered research programming. Up until recently, he served as a term member on the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Barzegar regularly consults leading humanitarian and advocacy organizations on policy, strategy, and research. Thank you all for being our guests today.
Thank you.
Okay, you know, you're more than welcome, all of you, to unmute whenever you do wish to speak. As I was saying before we started recording, we're by no means authoritarian at all, despite the fact that three of us decided to wear the exact same color. But we have a rogue element amongst us, which is great. Positive plurality and difference. Now, before we begin, we do have an apology from one of our guests who couldn't be with us this evening. Professor Anthony G. Reddy, Director of Oxford University Centre for Religion and Culture, is unfortunately unwell with COVID. We pray and wish that he has a speedy recovery. So, with all of that said, I think we'll dive right in. And my first question goes to Elizabeth. So, Elizabeth, tensions often arise in secular spaces with respect to religion being conflated with constraints on freedom of expression. So when we do have religion respected, some people think, oh, well, you know, this is hampering my freedom of expression. But then the opposite also stands true in some regard. So faith-based domains, we might have, you know, issues surrounding respect for the plurality of opinions that might be deemed an affront to the sentiments of religious individuals or those more conservative-minded folks in the community. So obviously we grapple with these issues. How can we as a society manage such tensions and mitigate such hostilities that might arise? And basically, you know, based on the work that you've done, you know, you built Theos up from what it was, you've made it what it was before you left. How can we enable a more conducive encounter amongst people from all corners of this debate?
Just a small question then to kick off. Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking about what's the best direction to go in this. And actually, I've been doing some work recently with a couple of charities in this area, one called Perspectiva and one called Larger Us. And they're really looking at through this lens of division more generally. And I really think it's important, thank you for mentioning in your introduction, to put this in context, because it feels as if the increasing division and tribalism is what's making this debate so difficult, not necessarily the speech itself or the limits of speech or the limits of expression, but the way that we're reacting to things that we might previously have been able to tolerate. There's a great Parker Palmer quote that I really love. He's a kind of Quaker, democratic thinker in the sense of about democracy rather than party political. And he says, those who can hold tension in a heart-opening way will have much to contribute to the common good. And really, that's the kind of heart of what I'd want to say, learning to hold the tension, learning to tolerate the discomfort of living in a plural society, of encountering people who disagree with us or who are different from us, which frankly is a key task of being a human being, because every other human being will be different from us or disagree with us in some kind of way. There's a growing up process as individuals and societies. But there's a couple of things we can look at that help, one on a sort of social level and one on a personal level. If we're aware that the division and the tribalism and the kind of collective fight or flight, the sense of I think diffused fearfulness, which is making it quite hard for us to hear each other and see each other. We're very reactive at the moment. If that's part of the problem, then we need to think, what are the structures we can put in place? What are the structures that we can live into that will help us? And we know what helps. It's proximity over time, being with people different from us, who disagree with us regularly in common spaces. Often that is institutions where diverse groups come together, everyone has a common stake. The university should be one of those key institutions. Schools are a really key one, but also churches, mosques, synagogues, unions, these places of moral formation and belonging, which actually we're not so good at throwing ourselves into at the moment. And I think that's not unconnected to our waning ability to tolerate difference, to hold that tension. So institutions clearly define social contracts. What do we expect of each other? You know, narrating what kind of space we're in and what kind of speech is okay, and creating safe containers for us to disagree across these differences, and for the widest possible definition of freedom of expression to be genuinely a social good rather than to be causing harm and increasing further division.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of line I'd leave, which is I think important for societies and for individuals, is from a book about freedom of speech in universities. And they talk about being risk aware, not risk averse. Thinking through what harm might expressing this thing or holding this view very publicly and forcefully bring to others. But then balancing that with that's one of the only one of the moral considerations, and there may be still good reasons to express it, but being aware of it and therefore navigating that tricky thing, perhaps a bit more humanly and a bit more kindly.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. What I do want to do, just to follow up a little bit before I bring in our other speakers, you said some profound things that, you know, I do want to kind of hone in on a little bit about tolerance. You mentioned tolerate and, you know, to be risk aware, as if, you know, this is inevitable. Tensions, hot conflict, inevitable. We need to be aware. We need to be aware of the context. We need to be aware of the people. We also need to, as you said, a social contract needs to be formed, right? Now, often when we talk about tolerance, we talk about coming together. And you said, what is okay? We need to set the parameters of what is okay. So my question then, just a follow up to that is there markers of what is deemed legitimate and illegitimate tolerance? Is there, like, how do we assess what is okay? And who is doing the assessment as well? So two-pronged question again, Liz.
Yeah, and again, just a small one there. So I don't love toleration as a political concept.
Yeah.
I kind of reluctantly think there's a great thinker called Teresa Bejan who wrote Mere Civility, and her thing is tolerance is hard enough. Let's just aim for the low bar. From a Christian theological perspective, I would want to have a much more robust kind of agape neighbor love orientation, but we live in plural societies. I can't demand that of anyone else but myself. I do think when I'm using the word tolerance, that is actually much more emotional and psychological. It's about kind of citizen virtues,
right?
The inner work that we all need to do, that very many of us draw deeply on our faith traditions for, but there are secular tools to do that on, which is about what kind of person do I need to be a fruitful citizen who can serve the common good. So tolerating the fact that you are driving me bonkers, but I'm still going to work with you, is more what I was meaning by tolerance. Right. On the second thing, honestly, I have no idea. I'm going to read you two things from the European Convention on Human Rights thing on freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right, protected under common law, extends to the expression of views that may shock, disturb, or offend the deeply held beliefs of others. A few points down. Basically, hate speech is not protected. It is not always easy to draw the boundary between expressing intolerant or offensive views, which are afforded protection, and hate speech or other very offensive communication so serious it is not protected. The very, the legislative document from which all this discussion does not know how to draw this line, and so I would not.
Yeah,
would not try to.
That's where we're coming from. I think what we'll do is when we move, I think in the second round of questions, I will like us to kind of hark back to this. And, you know, often when we talk about tolerance, some people are of the view that we should be talking about acceptance instead. So we'll come to that again, I think. But thank you for that, Liz. I think now moving on to our second question, and this one I'll pose to Michael. So we opened up with this massive challenge. Now let's turn our thoughts to addressing some of these challenges, perhaps maybe talk towards solutions. So how best do we safeguard free speech while recognizing and maintaining the ensuing responsibility upon actors towards one another? So, you know, if we're entering a social contract, we are doing this for goodness, and there is this responsibility. How do we manage these hostilities and simultaneously uphold liberties?
Well, I love so much of what Elizabeth said, and so I might just end up emphasizing points, you know, that she's already made. I think something Elizabeth alluded to was, you know, a need to have an awareness of the context we're in. Mm-hmm. You know, but free speech principally, has applications in public life and in the American context, in speech that bumps up against sort of government sort of restrictions and oversight. I think sometimes when we try to import concepts of free speech that are meant for the public square into more coherent, smaller communities, then it sort of lends to a friction of both violence to the community and also a sense of aggrievement on the perspective of the individual. And so this awareness of where we are, what community and what sort of location are we seeking to speak from or restrict speech or encounter and sort of deal with speech is a really critical point. And then I'll just pick up on this is so very closely tied to the kind of people we are. That is just the essential point. There is no system of authority that is going to make us a people who can both deal with wisdom and grace and tolerance, with speech that runs counter to our point of view, and also be the kind of people who will use our own voice and our own speech in a way that's respectful of community indifference. There are certainly structures that can better facilitate a healthy discourse, but really this goes at the sort of final analysis to the kind of people we are. And often when we get into these debates about free speech, I often find that we're trying to solve through a system and solve through technique the things that we like least about ourselves and about our neighbors, when to a certain extent we do need to think about these forms of civic education and formation for public life. That is really the way that that we will be able to be healthy in an increasingly pluralistic environment.
Just to follow up on that, thank you for that, Michael. You mentioned structures. So instead of systems, there are certain structures. If you could elaborate a little bit what you mean by, you talked about civic education, but if you could just tell us a little bit more about these structures that are in place and what we ought to be doing with them.
Well, look, I think, I think there are, let's take government, for instance. Government has the right, to an extent, to advance particular point of view on subjects relevant to the public. And yet, if government is not restricted by a sense of accountability to the public at large, in other words, if the government misuses its power, then it can lead to conditions in which minorities, ideological minorities, other forms of minority populations, obviously, to a certain extent, rebel against the sort of speech restrictions and the cultural sort of energy that government can put behind particular points of view. I think this also applies to philanthropy, which is, if I think there are real tensions to be navigated as philanthropy seeks to advance their particular missions through programmatic funding and deciding who to support, how to support, and who not to support. if the funding is, here's one general rule, if the funding is meant to influence communities, but is not supporting those communities, that can lead to a real culture of antagonism that creates real speech difficulties, real sense of sort of cultural control among local communities. And so for government, philanthropy, churches, other mediating institutions, there needs to be a cognizance both of the authority that they have and a willingness to place limits on the use of that authority that may not be that may need to be imposed from within the institution itself, not from the outside.
This is a really good point, and I think it's with that we can ask Abbas to join us in this debate and this discussion. So turning to you, and based on what has just been said, so how do these debates, if we can take them further, how do they pan out in the sector of philanthropy a little bit more? If we could take what Michael said and kind of run with it, is there really such a thing as an industry of hate funding? Because that's, something that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. And I think, it would be nice to be able to just take a step back and maybe describe for the audience the US context.
Yes, please.
Because I do believe that there's significant differences that allow for us to maybe think about how to find solutions to this shared problem. But before I jump into that, I just really want to uplift one point that Elizabeth, if I may, had made earlier that I want to come back to if we have a chance later. And that is, if the founding legislative document can't answer this, then we should be humble about what approaches and what possibilities we have, right? And I find the same thing in the United States. The Supreme Court is still wrestling with this on a regular basis. And so let's be a little humble in terms of how we approach the issue, or a little, kind of temper our expectations. And then Michael, I just loved what you said about the fact that there is no authority to make us human and civil, right? We're not going to legislate or sort of prosecute our way to civil society, right? Like, we're not going to be a better civil society, if you will, because somebody's forcing us. And so I'm hoping those are some themes that we can come back to a little bit later. But I would like to just briefly describe, and answer the question about, is there an industry of hate funding? And so the short answer, and spoiler alert, is yes, there is. But the context in the US side of it is that the truth is that there's not really something called hate speech in the United States. All right. If you really look at the letter of the law, hate speech or speech becomes illegal, and some folks can call it hate speech, when it's illegal for other reasons that disqualify it as speech. And that's not because it attacks a person or maligns somebody. It's because it makes a threat of harassment. It incites violence. It's not even about defamation, right? It's about a type of activity that is already illegal. It's a form of violence. And so when speech bleeds into that kind of space, then it's no longer speech, it's no longer protected. But in general, the United States has this ridiculously high threshold compared to our European and British counterparts that allows you to say sort of whatever it is. I mean, we're raised in my particular context, in my life experience, hearing egregious things on national radio or on television about Muslims. I mean, you're talking about things like, let's bomb Mecca. And I'm like, whoa, FCC, like, where are we? And no, nothing's wrong with that. And so that's one. Then the other bit is that because of that threshold, the IRS gives out pretty easily 501c3 designations, and there's nothing that would disqualify you for the type of speech and public education you give to say now you fall into hate speech, right? The IRS gives 501c3 designation on a very regular basis, which is your nonprofit status. Excuse me, is that what the credit?
Yeah, could you tell us, our audience, what IRS actually stands for, what you're referring to? Because just for...
Oh, it's like, we all in the States know what the IRS is. Sorry, the IRS, it's our most dreaded institution is the Internal Revenue Service, right? And so these are the tax collectors and those who designate our different our legal entities and their different tax structures. So yes, the IRS hands out 501c3 designation, which is our nonprofit charitable status, which allows an organization or an entity to operate on a tax-free basis, right? And so all of our religious institutions by default fall underneath this system, and then other, organizations can pick up that type of designation fairly easily. There are some reporting requirements and there are some thin regulatory requirements, but by and large, the charitable sector and the philanthropic sector, if you want to kind of lump them together, because the philanthropy is also a charitable entity, it's highly unregulated, self-regulated, and so if you look at the reality of the numbers and the statistics, the largest amount of hate funding, the way that we can calculate it, actually comes from the National Christian Foundation. Okay, so for the advocacy groups that have identified what groups are sponsoring, what philanthropic organizations are sponsoring hate organizations, and we can bracket whatever that means at the moment. If you look at the numbers, the National Christian Foundation is way ahead. I mean, you're way ahead of even than Fidelity, Schwab, and others in terms of funding flows going through these entities to fund so-called designated hate groups. And that's how it works, basically, is because you don't have a legal designation, folks can do and say what they want by and large, unless, just short of violence or incitement to violence, then it's very easy for an individual to fund the groups that they support. And it's fundamentally a question about what kind of cause do you want to support, and it's just part of American civil society. And so it is quite large. The state of research is a little bit hazy. I would say it's not very complete on how to track these flows of funding, exactly what they are, where they are, what the differentials are between types of organizations, how egregious and how dangerous some are as opposed to others. And there's some real questions that need to be sorted out there, and we're hoping to be able to participate in some of that research. But by and large, yes, there is a very robust hate funding, hate funding world out here. And again, you're talking, some will say $10 million a year, some will say $20 million a year. It just depends on how you kind of crunch the numbers, but it's real and it's a tough one to crack.
Before we ask you how do we address this challenge, you mentioned something that I want to point out about thresholds. So you said that there's a certain threshold that is maintained within society, specifically the American context. Now, this kind of goes back to what Michael and Elizabeth were saying about, and especially what Michael had said about there's no authority that can govern us or tell us that, we need to be good people. So this is, again, like this threshold idea. Obviously, that is from the people, that is from the ground up. So again, this is more of a societal issue than anything. So how do we address that before we even get to stopping funding that is potentially fueling hate? This threshold point, I want us to kind of talk about that a little bit. That's kind of a result of the social framework and fabric. That's kind of what we're addressing then.
Yeah, I mean, if we're gonna say we don't want to depend upon a legal threshold, if that's what I'm hearing, because I was referring to sort of a legal threshold that needs to be breached in order for something to be declared illegal. But if we want to talk about what are these other parameters, the Horizon Forum, our organization, focuses exclusively on coaching community foundations and other philanthropic institutions on how to manage issues of extremism, anti-democratic activity, hate speech, etc. And because philanthropy and other charitable institutions are public-private partnerships, really, because they're publicly subsidized, right? That money should be taxed. And so if it's not taxed, it technically really belongs to the public good. So I ask in some of our kind of in our sessions with leadership in this sector, I say, imagine yourself to be a theater, like a theater or an opera house in an old town, like in a small town. Okay, you are the center of public life. You help steward our civil society and our collective life. And if you were operating a theater and and you had requests for different plays, which would be the nonprofit organization seeking funding, okay? You know, you wouldn't just allow any show to operate at your theater. You would have some level of parameters on what you would consider acceptable discourse for your community. And that's what these organizations are doing, is that they're curating a civil society space. And so I just asked them, you know, think about what kind of community, local level community you would want to have. And don't ask a legal question. Don't ask a technical question, because this isn't a question about legal compliance. This is a question about ethics and community. So ask yourself that question. Would you allow, would you allow a pornographic show in the middle of the afternoon in a community theater? No, of course you wouldn't, right? We don't do that with radio. We don't do that with television. We have parameters that are way outside of the boundaries of law that we've self-regulated. And so those, if that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, those are conscious decisions that we have to make. We have to say no to certain things. We have to say yes to certain things. And what we try to do is empower the leadership in this space to feel comfortable making those decisions on their own, without having to rely upon general counsel all the time, and without having to resort to a crisis communications team or something like that. Like, let's just be honest about what we're doing here. Especially philanthropy, especially the community foundations. You're funding the tone and tempo of our civil society and the debates that we have right now. So let's take some ownership over that and not hide behind like legal categories.
Right, exactly. So thank you for mentioning the parameters. And this is essential, you know, as you talked about setting the parameters of the civil society. It goes back to Elizabeth's point about the social contract, and we engage within a society. What are the boundaries within which we are working? What is the framework, right? So bringing Elizabeth back in now, I think is a great opportunity. And let's turn and focus a little bit on civil society and the role that it plays in all of this, Elizabeth. Is there an obligation then on part of civic society actors to protect a sense of the sacred? Broadly defined, this is up to you to define, and if so, how do we actually define it? And just a side note for our listeners, Elizabeth has a wonderful podcast called The Sacred, which I'm sure many of us are aware of. So that got me thinking, actually, Elizabeth, you'd be best placed to help us unpack the term and whether civil society, based on what Abbas's parameters discussion was, what are these parameters? What do they look like? And do we have a role in civil society to safeguard the sacred?
I just real quickly, I will say I am fully prepared to throw my support behind a government and societal mandate to support Elizabeth's podcast. And so whatever levers need to be used.
Yeah.
This is acceptable state coercion.
Yeah.
Huh, Michael? This is acceptable.
You could just funnel all the hate speech funding over here. That would be fine.
I too support this, but we do have our biases because, Michael, you are a former guest on that podcast, so I would cat's out of the bag now. So but thank you for
friends. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so I've done this podcast for more than 3 years now, interviewed more than 200 people, and as I suspected, there's no easy definition for the sacred. But actually that's almost part of the point, that we need to surface these things, and there isn't a mandate for civil society organizations to be doing it. I would love generally in how we live and how we order our lives, there to be more space to reflect on what is deepest to us and what is deepest to others. These are the things that are hardest to talk about, right? They are the ineffable, the hard to define, the easily kind of hallmark cardable deepest things of our lives. But we live in an age of distraction. And I don't think many organizations, unless they're kind of explicitly part of their mission, should be tightly defining what the sacred is. But every organization that is seeking to be humane and healthy and contributing to the common good should be holding open space for these things. Mm-hmm. And one helpful definition, and actually it goes right back to the journey that I went on it about what the sacred is from the anthropologist Scott Atran, who did a lot of work in the kind of anthropology of conflict, and he always uses the phrase sacred values to mean the things that if you tried to give someone money to give up, they would be less likely to give up. That these are things outside of market values. They are not necessarily counter, but certainly different in quality from market values. And he says, he always uses the example of the Israel-Palestine conflict and says, what you've not got is a bunch of rational actors that if you give them enough money or an equivalent amount of land, everything's going to be fine and everyone's going to go home feeling like they've got their needs met. Actually, there's something much deeper about the sacred value of the land and the sacred value of these stories and these communities and these forms of belonging. And so I do think that institutions that can say capitalism can be great for some things, the market is a really useful mechanism for some things, but deep within us as humans are things that need fences around them so that the market can't touch them. That is what the sacred is, and we will fight for it.
Right. And in fighting for it, when we define ourselves as who we are, does everyone have an obligation then to protect that? Who's doing the protection? Is there a coalition of stuff? And this is a question that I'm not just posing to Elizabeth, but I understand the other, feel free to chime in at any point, Michael, or even Abbas.
I mean, I don't think in a plural society we have the right to ask anyone else to defend our sacreds. Mm-hmm. I think we have a call to listen to each other's, and that in that listening, we will better understand where the conflict actually is. We're often having these proxy wars about presenting issues that are not actually about the presenting issue, but they're easier to talk about because they're concrete. That's a news story or a particular piece of legislation or whatever it is. And underneath it is a deep clash of sacred values. And when we kind of turn those cards over or try and explain why we care so deeply about this thing, why we're prepared to express ourselves in ways that hurt other people, or why we feel so offended by someone else's expression, that almost shifts us out of the like fighty mode. There's a different kind of energy, a different kind of neural pathway, however you want to explain it, that gets you into a more human encounter. And so I just think the sacred is this hugely useful thing, even though it's very nebulous, bringing us into a more Martin Buber style I thou, really seeing each other.
Right. No, this is great. So as you initially you talked about moving away from divisions of tribalism and towards heart opening conversations and steering things towards, I guess, a more human experience. And that's essentially the crux of what's running through most of our discussion today. But then, as Michael said earlier, this need for accountability and that we need to have a willingness as well. We need to be prepared to act upon that. And I think that kind of brings us, I want to focus on this question of accountability, especially with regards to faith-based advocacy. First, we had the question about the sacred. Now I want, Abbas, if I could bring you in, what are some of the ways that nonprofits can serve to increase this public literacy, not just around sacred issues, but just, having these conversations? How do we educate on such matters whilst maintaining a rigorous debate on inevitably sensitive issues? And this, it's the reason I mentioned earlier, it's basically, how do we have efficacy of accountability when it comes to faith-based advocacy with all of this in mind?
Well, thank you for the question, but I really like the way that the conversation is intersecting here, and I want to.
Sure.
I think the answer that Elizabeth gave about around the sacred and using the sacred as a frame for us to have some kind of dialogue there, it really ties in with something that I've thought about a lot in context of political polarization, and it's actually interesting because, for me, the current context and the current climate of polarization in the United States is actually. I approach that issue in the same way that I thought about polarization and radicalization in some Middle Eastern contexts, right? And out of the context of sort of, the early, 2000s debates around, so-called Islamic extremism and whatnot. And one of the ways that I always try to push back against policymakers or academic frames was to try to get to a point where we're no longer characterizing this opponent or this other in our own terms, but instead really try to say, okay, if you see a far right movement or an Islamist movement or a militant movement? Can we ask certain kind of questions that would, at least for a thought experiment, and frankly, in a university setting, I think this is appropriate. I don't always think this is appropriate everywhere, but I'll just give you the thought experiment. And that is, instead of asking a question like, why do they hate us? Or why do they speak in such hateful language? Or why are they so extremist? Just ask, and this is connected to the question about the sacred, what do they love? Right? What is it that they love? Yeah. Because most expressions of anger and most expressions of anger, frustration, and things that occur in our cultural debates today, most of them are not coming from a kind of pathologically evil space. They're coming from a sort of pain, fear. They're coming from these different sort of spaces because they love something. People love things. And so if you start talking about why we love and why this is animating us so much, you know, to me, this is a way that you could be accountable. And I tell our folks because I'm decidedly and firmly, in my advocacy work, very much on the sort of, left of center, quite left of center. And so, but I tell my colleagues, like, we cannot be making, these kind of caricatures of our opponents. And we cannot be sort of reducing their claims to, like, there's this myth that like every conservative is just, uneducated or something like that, and that they're just ignorant. And I mean, that's just it's already like a dehumanizing thing. You cannot make these generalizations. You can't ascribe false consciousness to people, bad faith to people. I mean, that's not a starting point. So in our own advocacy work, I won't listen to a discussion that starts that way. You have to be respectful of people's sacred boundaries, their priorities, their commitments, and frankly, the things that they love. And so the ways to be accountable for me is just be responsible in the way that we're talking about each other before we even talk to each other. I'm not even confident that we can talk to each other, at least, before we start saying, let's talk to each other, like, how do we talk about each other in a certain way? And that requires a deep level of sort of respect and recalibration. And our funders, by the way, need to make those kind of demands clear, because frankly, funders on both sides are funding the extremist elements of our civil society that are really loud. And they hide behind the veneer of philanthropic altruism, when in fact they control the space. I mean, they control our civil society space, and they could make demands upon their advocacy partners in particular ways that, could actually have an impact. So that's what I think accountability looks like.
That's wonderful. I think it's a really great way of understanding the other, rather than just saying, we need to understand hate and why people are fueled with bigotry, but actually what makes people tick, what really is dear to them. And is that kind of how you do things? So you mentioned the work that you do with Horizon Forum, and is that kind of what foregrounds everything, that you need to understand how people tick, or what is what you apply in your work? Just curious.
No, actually, sorry, we don't really do much of the interpersonal work at Horizon Forum. No, yeah, we don't do much of that. I think that there are people who, I imagine, like Elizabeth and Michael and yourself, frankly, who do that interpersonal kind of work a lot better, that kind of dialogue. In some ways, what Horizon Forum does is provide what Michael mentioned. There are sort of technical solutions that we provide to philanthropic organizations, policy guidelines, decision trees, basically ways that the policy infrastructure of an organization and the institutional leadership can approach these issues, in a way that kind of avoids conflict, reduces risk. So yeah, you can kind of chuck everything I said out the door about all the dialogue and personal stuff, because the work at Horizon Forum is very think tankish, very technical, solutions oriented, because ultimately what we're trying to do is translate these concepts and these ethical principles into something that looks like institutional practice. And so for an institution to do something, and people within that institution to operate, sure, everybody could have the right mindset, but these are job descriptions, right? These are policies, governance, these are contracts with donors, and so that sort of almost legalese has to be in place in order for things to be operational in an institutional setting. And I think it's one of the major gaps that we have in general, whether it's academia or ethical institutions, our ethical and religious faith-based institutions. How do you translate all these principles, academia, ethics, into policy practice, whether in government or large, multi-levered institutions? We're not talking about like one church or something like that, but a corporation that, is controlling billions and billions of dollars. How do you translate those principles into practice? That's what Horizon Forum really does, is serve that translation piece.
Thank you, Abbas. I think just building on that, and before we even get to translations, and this is a question I think I'll just kind of pose to all of you before we move on, is going back to this concept of willingness. So how do we ensure that there is a willingness to engage or even potentially rectify our ways on part of all key stakeholders? So Abbas, in your case, you were discussing the nonprofit sector. How do you do it? What would you incentivize willingness? Because Michael, you mentioned that earlier as well. There needs to be a willingness. We need to be cognizant. And Elizabeth, you do that. I know you have done that with Theos as well. Inculcate the sense of, willingness and then identity and getting to know the neighbor. How do we do it?
Oh, I mean, it's the question that was going around as Abbas was talking, that that's what I started with, that there needs to be kind of social structural medicines for this, and then kind of personal character and virtue formation medicines for this. And it's really difficult to separate the two, because you get a virtuous cycle or a kind of breakdown cycle or a breakthrough cycle, depending on those. But we can't require soul work of other people, and it gets super creepy when government or other institutions start requiring virtue, character. It's only really within educational context that we're prepared to tolerate that, and there's still a huge debate about whether we are actually prepared to tolerate that, or whether education should just be about like knowledge and facts. Yeah. Because we have this, the Charles Taylor thing about such deep fundamental difference about what the good is, and we've gone to war on it repeatedly, and so let's just pretend it's not there and focus on the kind of technocratic things we can agree on. Sorry, that's just me repeating the complexity.
No, I see Michael. Do you want to chime in, Michael? Because I noticed that you were nodding along, and I wonder.
Yeah, well, so a few, I think, related thoughts. Elizabeth talked about sort of the logic of the market being sort of allowed to dictate too much, and I'll be honest, I've come across, in the American context, which I think is quite different, but maybe there will be some shared lessons. I have talked to funders who have said that they don't get involved with religion because of the separation of church and state. At which point I'm forced to ask them, well, which of those do you think you are, the church or the state? The answer, of course, is neither, but the sort of they are following a logic that I think is appropriate for government to hold, but that should be an invitation for private philanthropy in this instance to actually step in the gap where government funding can't and perhaps shouldn't go, but these sorts of logics that I don't think apply are allowed to apply and really prevent us from taking advantage of some key opportunities. In 2006, Barack Obama gave a speech on his sort of view of faith in public life, and it was quite remarkable. The speech came less than 2 years after Democrats had lost a presidential election to George W. Bush, in which the Democrats' nominee in 2004 stumbled around faith. And Barack Obama, in this 2006 speech, said that secularists were wrong to ask people of faith to leave their faith outside the door of public life. He said it was a practical absurdity to ask them to do so. Another way of saying what Barack Obama was getting at in this speech is you must provide people the opportunity to act on their loves. This is like to Abbas's point, right? It's not just about finding out what their loves are, but if people do not have a viable path to positively act on what they love through what you're providing, they will find other, perhaps more malevolent sort of forums on which to act on these, on their affections and their identities. And so I would just add this responsibility that we have within proper boundaries, of course, but of providing imagination and allowing the room for imagination for how people might live out their values and who they are in a way that is oriented toward the good of community, and not immediately shutting down or asking them to sort of take on the burden of translating their values for sort of a public acceptance before they enter the public square. That is a burden that we should be careful about placing on the average citizen.
Absolutely, thank you for that, Michael. It speaks a lot to marginalized groups, especially as we mentioned earlier, that have been stigmatized and are constantly expected to prove that they are normal, that they are human.
Yes.
Humanity. So, I'm sure we can go on with that. But Abbas, do you have any points to make on this particular question? Or
well, on the incentive piece,
yeah.
Again, I don't want to sound, I don't want the spirit of what I'm about to say, or what I'm about to say, destroy the spirit of sort of what I was saying earlier. But on the incentive piece, when we're talking about institutions in a legal and political context, political pressure, public pressure provides a kind of soft coercive, incentive, if you will. I would love to think that we can incentivize people to act from these spaces of good, of altruism, investment in the public space, etc. But the fact is that we're in a politically charged environment. People are extremely sensitive and responsive to media attention. And so how can we sort of use that as a soft, coercive space? And I don't want to give up too much of the secret recipe over here, but what we're doing is, we tell folks, like, look, this is the context that we live in. Whether you agree or don't agree with the ethical principles here and the kind of larger religious or faith-based principles or the ethical principles, whatever it is, whether you believe in that or not, the fact of the matter is that this is the context that we live in. You should be prepared for it. Or you might get caught up in a headline sometime. Do you know what I mean? Or you might get caught up in a political fight sometime, and your organization might not know how to deal with it. So from a basic risk mitigation point of view, what is your institution doing to prepare for the political and social context that we live in? And to me, that's an incentive in some ways. It's not the same kind of incentive, I think, that we're talking about. But again, dealing not with social and cultural work here, but with the concrete realities of moving institutions through policy, I believe requires a different approach.
Yeah, that's really important. Sorry, Liz.
No, it's fine. I feel like there's a helpful double act going on in that I'd say yes, structures, and I do feel like structures have a huge part to play in the kind of sort of social permission of what is acceptable and what isn't. I do think that there should be a much bigger burden placed on our information technology and our kind of digital community sites that are, as we're seeing more and more, actively incentivizing the opposite, actively incentivizing division, harmful expression. It's not the kind of like, hands-off, disinterested, just feeding people what they already wanted algorithm design that's being played, that we are being formed into division, into use of our speech that harms us and others by the platforms that we are using every day. And I have no doubt now, having talked to people about this for 3 years, that is 60% of what's driving why this is getting harder and is so difficult. So they should be incentivized / nationalized as the kind of public utility that they're becoming. I do think that there's something about the stories that we tell. Actually, no one wants to live in a deeply divided, very easily offended, highly reactive, painful, conflicted common life. It's horrible. It's just a really uncomfortable place. That high trust societies are happier societies. It's just that our initial fight or flight reactive kind of social trauma need is very defended. And so I think there might be something in the stories that we tell about high trust societies. It happened a bit during the pandemic. Good news stories of interaction across difference, of things like citizens campaigns that bring together people who might disagree very deeply on things for common goals. Something about storytelling, painting a picture of a society that is plural and a bit noisy, a bit spiky at times, but fundamentally high trust that we all want to move towards, has got to be part of the picture.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of like this balance. Michael, I noticed that do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, just a quick word of caution, which is that I know Abbas spends a lot of time, and I really look to him so often for wise judgment about the contours of these things. But just for listeners, I do want to the kinds of tools of political and legal coercion Abbas is talking about are really effective when used with discernment.
Yeah.
When they are used not just to prevent the worst of the worst, but to impose a sort of more holistic vision of where you want society to be headed, sort of ideally, then I think you get the kind of reaction, the kind of right-wing reaction that we're seeing in the US across much of Europe. And so I think I do think that there are times and circumstances that call for this sort of soft coercion, but we really need to be humble about the scope of desired ends to which we use that. And so we may have values about what an ideal society would look like, but soft coercion might only be appropriate to achieve 5%, 2% of that, and then the rest has to be hashed out through persuasion and through more sort of regular means of public and political discourse.
And I should say that we don't actually engage in any of that sort of advocacy, even coercive. It's almost if the political context is sort of open the ears and eyes of certain leaders, that's when we jump in with what you're talking about, Michael. You know what I mean? And find that kind of soft. But the charged context, I believe, of our political moment is actually a space that opens up those conversations, right? And if you enter those conversations with the discernment you're talking about, Michael, I think that folks are very receptive, which is why we don't do public advocacy, which is why we don't involve ourselves in this sort of concrete public anti-hate work, right? We're just in this sort of policy advising space and thought leader, what we'd like to think is thought leadership space.
Well, that's great. And I think that's wonderful. We have these various different perspectives. Obviously, Elizabeth coming from, more of the civil society. How do we grow and act together in these spaces on a human level? And of course, Abbas, you've offered quite tangible solutions in terms of, okay, well, this is what needs to be done. This is people do have to listen when not just the brunt or the force of the law, but just the reality of it. That if you want to function within this society, these are the parameters that are set, and you do have to abide by them. So I guess it's a healthy balance of kind of leading with love and understanding individuals and what makes them tick, but also reality of the situation, context on ground. This is what we live in. This is a society we live in, and this is what the legislature says as well. And it's kind of taking all of that together. I think we'll move on to, I think, one of the final questions that I wish to ask, and kind of before we engage in a bit more discussion, and then following that Q&A. I want to bring in faith and interfaith, and I want to pose this question to you, Michael, and then others feel free to chime in as well. In a world full of such tense debates that we are experiencing, how do we build harmony in society? How do we strike that balance that we've talked about? And in particular, what role does interfaith play in facilitating this?
Yeah, so I think one of the mistakes that gets made when we talk about interfaith is we think the necessary sort of convening force has to be faith differences. And so our vision of interfaith work is let's get people of different faiths together to talk about their competing visions of the divine, and often that is with the hope that they'll discover that really that they don't disagree all too much, or there's a common thread within. I think these, as well-intentioned as they could be and as productive as they could be for some people, are often counterproductive efforts. I think what's been more useful is to convene interfaith groups around purposes and goals that aren't explicitly faith-based. And so my friend Eboo Patel at Interfaith Youth Court does great work around this, where the idea isn't let's get people around a table to talk about whose theological truths are really true, but is there a school in our community that our individual faiths might call us to serve and improve? Is there a particular pressing social issue that the resources of our individual faiths can contribute towards addressing those social problems? I think, again, giving people the ability and the route to productively act on what they believe in communities of difference with others, that is what helps stoke the imagination for how we might live together with our difference. Right now, I think we too often, both from those who are well-meaning and want to sort of build a diverse society, and then of course those who want anything but, both often say the same thing, which is your actual particular truths shouldn't matter in society. That actually what you have to contribute is a sort of muted, depersonalized contribution that sort of fits into these boxes. And that is the kind of approach that leads people into more tribal communities, that if they can't, if they don't have a route to express themselves as they are in public, in diversity, then they will find communities that empower them to do so, perhaps in ways that are not social.
Absolutely. Elizabeth or Abbas, would you add anything to that before I chime in?
Not much. My experience and my kind of interests have been less in interfaith and more in the kind of intra-faith, those who are not religious and find the whole idea laughable, and people of faith, and trying to build understanding between those. And I do think, personally, I wonder if that's more urgent, because it feels like such a one of those deep differences we've talked about, and very easy to dismiss and dehumanize each other.
So changing the question a little bit then, obviously, because the framework from which we've started this was the secular and the religious, almost like a binary, as if it's already imposed. How do you work within those porous zones then, Elizabeth?
I mean, I think it's the sort of anti-tribalism habits that apply in any situation, which is just get out of your bubble, spend time with people who are different from you, learn to listen to them, be present in other places and listen into other conversations, and then find the common threads and see if you can narrate them back to people. But it requires a commitment to, it's reminding me of an old hymn about being a pilgrim.
Oh, do share.
I will not sing it for you. But there's something about, a commitment to, and it comes back to this holding tension thing of being beyond your tribe and having deep enough roots into your place of belonging, your faith or your family or wherever you get your stable sense of identity, that it's not threatened by being amongst people different from you.
I'm sorry, just one quick note on something Elizabeth keeps on bringing up, which is this idea of a sort of persistent, engaged interaction with those who are not like you. There's a mystic and a theologian by the name of Howard Thurman, who, when assessing the development of hatred, particularly in a racial context, but he really meant this to apply more broadly, talked about the development of hatred as not developing between those who do not know each other at all, but in a context of what he called contact without fellowship, which is something that I think we profoundly find ourselves in now, which is not that we don't, which is this false sense of knowing who the other is, that we have just enough of a window into often the most extreme voices of those from communities, from other communities, that we feel like we know who the conservative Christian is, or who the Muslim is, or who the Trump supporting Republican is, or who the Bernie Sanders supporting Democrat is, or but we don't really know them. And so this comes up in social science research all the time. So for instance, like in the American context, the Democrats have, when you ask Democrats who the prototypical Republican is, it's vastly different from who the prototypical Republican is. It's just condensed, sort of crystallized stereotype, and vice versa. So like, the Republican will drastically overstate the percentage of Democrats that are not religious, that are LGBT, that are, go down the line. And so this idea of not just putting people into contact with those who are different, but as Elizabeth is saying, now, how do we create environments of true sharing of knowledge and a deepening sense of familiarity that don't allow people to skate by? Thurman described it as if you were in a car with locked doors, looking out the window, driving through a neighborhood that was not your own. That to me is what Twitter is. Like, Twitter is driving down a road in a community that is not your own, with the windows up and looking out the window, and think that just the vision that you're seeing is an accurate picture of the communities you're looking at. And that is that can be deeply destructive.
Absolutely. And just kind of thinking through that, as the Twitter comment made us chuckle quite a bit. But these spaces will always exist, and where we have this dialogue, where we facilitate these conversations. But I guess, just to add to your point, Michael, that sometimes there is an onus and responsibility on those more middle ground voices, or I'd say balanced voices in a way, to really step up a little bit. And occupy that space, kind of own it a little bit, as opposed, because this void will be filled. There's no shortage of people, and especially polarized voices, to then take hold of this space and then wield that narrative as being the archetype or the stereotype that then others run with, and that can be then the force for hate. Anyway, I think before we open, yes, Abbas, would you like to?
Just wanted to stitch something together. I really like both these points Michael made and Elizabeth made about contact piece, and I just wanted to bring back, Michael, you had made that point about how do you come together in meaningful, actionable work that's not necessarily faith-based, right? That is collective public good anyway. So I just want to flag that in the work that I've witnessed and sort of, you know, observed up close in the faith-based humanitarian space. Michael, you know, we've talked about this for a while. I mean, I just think that there are so many areas of human social services being done by the faith-based sector, by the interfaith sector on a local level, all around the world, and Western institutions actually working together in contexts abroad. You know, we have this huge Afghan resettlement issue right now. And every time there's a refugee problem, whether it was Iraq, Syria, now Afghanistan, faith-based communities are lined up working together in super productive ways. And the fact that we don't have that as part of our mainstream narrative, right? You know, I just think those are stories that need to be told. And so that leadership also just needs to be amplified so that the ranks of others can be deep, you know, kind of depolarized and provide that, you know, we talk a lot about alternative narratives in these kind of contexts. And I think that's a great one to pursue, you know, so funders should be funding stuff like that.
Absolutely, that's a great message. So before we open to the Q&A, is there anything that perhaps we haven't touched on? I'm just giving space to our panelists that you would like to flag up, just as Abbas has done. Elizabeth, Michael, is there anything? No? Abbas, anything else that you would like to point out that we haven't?
No, that was really a major point there.
That was what I wanted to do. Okay, well, in that case, we do have a couple of questions. We'll start with the question from David Rothwell. And obviously, I'm going to open this to all three of you, and depending on who wants to take which question first. The concept of laïcité is more than secularism or tolerance. How best to remove religious symbols from those exercising state authority? Is that the question is basically asking, secularism is laïcité more than secularism or tolerance, and how best can we remove religious symbols from those exercising state authority, if in fact that is something that we wish to do? So I'm just going to add to that question. Who would anyone like to take that question?
There's a sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth, Michael, one of you know this better than I, but there's this great way of describing the difference between secularism and laïcité in the US context. I always fumble it, but I'm sure one of you all.
It might be the Rowan Williams thing about procedural versus programmatic secularism is a really useful distinction. It's basically everyone's allowed on the pitch, but the referee's pretty careful about making sure it's a fair game, would be a good, in Rowan Williams' perspective, procedural kind of secularism, whereas programmatic secularism is really you send off a bunch of players because they're not allowed. I am no particular fan of laïcité, and so I am less bothered about religious symbols than kind of posture and tone towards those who don't share the faith. You know, we live in a very strange UK set up with a national church that I think generally allows quite a good flourishing of kind of plural faiths, and so I think it can be worked out in lots of different ways.
The Americans, would you like to address that in any way? Michael, do you want to chime in?
Well, look, as soon as you take a firm position on this question, something will happen that makes you think, gosh, is that really right? So I've generally been someone who thinks that the costs of procedural or programmatic secularism are far too great, are far too, frankly, anti-democratic. And I still hold that position. On the other hand, you know, the leaders you elect are really important. We recently had an elected leader who cleared a park and stood in front of a church holding a Bible, saying he'd defend the Bible as a campaign statement with the force of government behind him, which, you know, is a pretty striking caution against the conflation of religious symbols and political authority. So, I think there are real dangers. On the other hand, as Barack Obama said in that same 2006 speech, what is American political and social life if you strip out King on the steps of the Washington Monument, or Dorothy Day, or Lincoln, and his inaugural. And so, again, this goes back to the point of there are some clear, in the American context, some clear constitutional parameters. Within those parameters, you need healthy leaders, and you need a populace that is willing to disincentivize the worst behavior.
Absolutely. I think we can move on to the next question, which is from Chris Houston. If all individuals followed the tenets of their own faiths about tolerance, perhaps there would be less conflict. They'd like a comment on that. Would that regarding following the tenets of faith and regarding tolerance? Elizabeth, I see you smiling, and Michael, sorry.
Well, no. So I'll just quickly say one thing that I like about this question is it's sort of an assumption that there are resources within these traditions that can be drawn upon for navigating difference. In 2019, I received support from the Democracy Fund to release a report on Christianity, pluralism, and public life in the United States that drew on interviews with over 50 Christian leaders. And the report is exactly that, laying out the resources from within the Christian tradition for navigating and supporting a healthy pluralism. And I think those kinds of conversations, not what must you, and this goes to Abbas's point again, not what must you give up about your faith to be acceptable to society, but actually what can you bring from your faith and from your convictions that can be of benefit and value to society. That's a healthier way to proceed, and it's also just more likely to be successful. We need to help. If the conversation in these contexts are between those who say that religion is a barrier to a healthy pluralism, and those who say that religion itself disallows pluralism, that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for most of the people in our societies to envision what their life might look like in what is inherently, without debate, a pluralistic society. And so it's how do you create space for talking about the direct line between their traditions and navigating difference.
Thank you for that, Michael. And it kind of, there's a follow-up question from the same person regarding immigrants and requiring them to give up their faith. Should immigrants be required to give up their faith and adopt the faith of their adoptive country? Which is a very interesting comment to make, but just for the sake of, that this is an open space, but these are the sort of questions then emerge. If we're talking about creating spaces, surely, people are coming from certain positions where they're going to ask these sort of questions as if there is a particular adopted faith, and it's just I find questions of this kind actually quite interesting as well. So I'm just putting it out there for our panelists to think about, not necessarily answer, but if anyone would like to chime in on a question of this nature, please feel free.
No.
Okay, great.
No, they shouldn't have to. I think there is a in terms of talking about the sacred and respect for the deep, precious things that other people hold.
No, of course not. No.
Well,
yeah, of course not. But let me just entertain sort of what that thought experiment
Please do.
is doing, right? And I think, again, thinking about a small town, okay, somewhere in any part of the world. And let me get my hats out of the Western, you know, kind of our European or American context here. You know, I have a friend in southern Turkey who his hometown is on the border of Syria and Turkey. Okay, it's a historical crossroads, but it was the home of sort of ground zero of the refugee inflows back in 2013 or so. And so that's when I started getting involved in looking at refugee response work. And this was a small town, 80,000 sleepy little agricultural community of 80,000 Turkish-speaking folks, okay, firmly within the Turkish nation state, et cetera. And so I asked him last week, and I visited this space, and it was already sort of burgeoning as this refugee sort of hotspot. So I asked him, you know, it was just a couple months ago, I said, you know, Mehmet, how's Kilis? How's your family? Well, it's not Kilis anymore, you know, because that 80,000 Turkish population was now overrun with 250,000 Syrian refugees. And it was now an Arab and Syrian speaking town. And so that's a drastic example, and that's just a culture change within the same religious group, within the same sect of the religion, within a context of already sort of pre-existing social, cultural, political ties. And that is a tension point, right? So we shouldn't expect people to, you know, to just accept radical changes in their communities, or what might be perceived as radical changes in their communities, because that might just be a perception issue as well. But if somebody has hesitancy over some changes that are happening within their community, you should accept that hesitancy, because that's coming from a human space, right? If you can't listen to that, then you know, those are sort of those listening gears that we have to get going. And then to the previous question, I just wanted to chime in quick about if people follow their own faith. You know, I just think fundamentally religion is an accelerant. And so whatever tradition, whatever thing is going on, all right, if it's moving in a quote unquote bad direction or a good direction, whatever it is, productive, slow, fast, whatever it is, it's like an additive you add to your engine. You know what I mean? It's going to make it go faster. It's going to make it go. So it's going to make it go worse. It's going to make it go better. You know what I mean? Whatever that might be. So I don't think there's this sort of fundamental essence of religion, but religiosity that does something to human behavior. And one of the pitfalls, I believe, that comes out of our sort of our academic discourse on religion is that we tend to believe that, you know, religion fundamentally is a good force. But I just think if you look at it as an additive on its own, that it does something different, you know, to our analysis.
It's a very interesting point to make. And I see, Elizabeth, you've been nodding along. If there's anything that any of our speakers would like to say before we wrap up, the space is yours.
I think I'd just follow on that. I don't think, speaking specifically from my Christian tradition, that Christianity gives us many resources for tolerance. I think it calls us to, and I eminently fail at this on the regular, a radical love of neighbor, a love for even our enemies. In fact, very specifically loving our enemies and praying for those who we find difficult / offend us / persecute us. And the Great Commission, which, depending on how you read it, might well require some inviting people into the story of Jesus, the love of God, however you want to frame that. And that in and of itself might feel intolerable to some people, might feel offensive, might feel challenging in plurality. And so I think Christianity both brings great resources for plural societies and in its very DNA provides challenges, because it has a kind of fundamental truth claim at its heart. And those always cause some friction.
Michael,
would you like to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think I do think we are in a period of really deep questioning about whether a society ever functions without truth claims, though. You know, I think that we're really starting to see a sort of real discrediting of sort of the Rawlsian sort of idea that, oh, it's like Christianity or it's religion that is bringing these claims, which is really mucking up like a frictionless society. And so I completely agree with what Elizabeth is saying, right? So my part of sort of my argument and what the report gets into, right, is that even the Great Commission, not to get into a theological sort of discourse here, but the Great Commission in a pluralistic context is moderated to an extent by the perspective that we don't believe faith comes through coercion, or that conversion is the responsibility of individual Christians. And so even the Great Commission is viable in an open, pluralistic society. And in fact, coercion can undermine the working out of the truth claims of the Christian faith. But maybe that's our next conversation.
I was going to say, we have a few follow-up events from this. Abbas, is there anything you would like to say before we wrap up?
No, I think I've gotten mine in. Thank you. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, Dr. Mahmood.
Well, I mean, there's lots to be said, but just building on what Elizabeth has said, with regards to the Christian faith, and it reminds me, this idea of love and compassion flows throughout most, if not all, faiths. So you mentioned about loving thy neighbor, within the Islamic tradition, we do have that too. This idea of, you are siblings in humanity or faith. So I guess we can extend this teaching, and it can be found, goodness can be found everywhere just as much as hatred can, as Michael was saying. These truth claims, they don't necessarily have to be religious in nature, they can be quite secularly minded. So it seems that difficult debates will go on, they're inevitable, they're long-standing, and the best way to address them is by ensuring that all spaces are safe and respectful. We do not have to agree or be the same. That's essential. That's not, that we need to have these differences, cherish these differences, and that plurality is enriching. I hope that has been, we gather this from this short discussion that we've had. But at the same time, what stands out, I feel, is the need for civil society actors to participate and not get hijacked by hate, whether that's by using, just following the procedures or the protocols, or the parameters in the legal sense, or more of the, we've talked about love, we've talked about being the goodness of humanity, even whether it's the theoretical, the abstract, or the very lived realities that people have. Because alarmingly, as I tried to mention earlier, without scaring people, there is a void quite often within these spaces, and balanced voices often stay silent because they think everyone thinks like us, right? There's no need for us to stand up. So people like us are getting together and actually having these really meaty debates. Whether we like it or not, these spaces will be occupied, right? Whether we're part of the equation or not. And I've come across this already. We have people from all ends of the spectrum, particularly who we would classify as hate-filled rhetoric, coming together, and they might actually hate each other, but they're bonding, they're unifying over a common hatred. Let's come together and coalesce and have this shared cohesion based on what Abbas said earlier on love, right? So change can only be made if we take initiative and if we are willing to step up. I guess that's it for me. Do so in unison as well, as we began earlier, that we need to build bridges. And it is about creating not only spaces, but also coalitions of like-minded people. With all that's been said, I'm sure we can carry this conversation. But for today, this is it. We hope to continue this discussion in a follow-up event in the spring, God willing. And so watch the space for more. I'd now like to thank our wonderful panelists from across the spectrum and across the continents for such a fruitful discussion, for your invaluable contributions. And I'd also like to thank Matt Clearly, for our events manager, for conducting behind the scenes and making sure that this program was brought to life. Finally, thank you to our audience who joined us today. Please do stay tuned for more in due course, and on behalf of our Cadbury Centre at the University of Birmingham, thank you for being with us today, and we shall see you again very, very soon.